Fyodor Dostoevsky emerged from the Gulag in 1846 as a changed man, forever altered from the naive idealist who entered 4 years earlier. The hardships and conditions he would face influenced him for the rest of his life, turning him from a radical revolutionary to a critic of nihilistic intellectualism. In order to understand Dostoevsky's transformation, though, we first have to examine how he got there. Dostoevsky's first novel, Poor Folk, gained him entry into a St. Petersburg literary circle known as the Petrashevsky Circle. The themes of this book centered around impoverished individuals and their interactions with the wealthy, signaling his early humanitarian interests. The Petrashevsky Circle was a gathering of progressive intellectuals dedicated to a socialist utopian agenda, citing forbidden Western philosophical and literary ideas and trying to reimagine Russia as a more democratic and free country. Specifically, their views opposed the Russian Tsar at the time, Nicholas I, who saw the Petrashevsky Circle and other groups like it as a significant threat to his power. Nicholas was a stark departure from his predecessor Alexander, lacking his brother's romantic inclinations and being more of a military leader. He was an autocrat who preferred ruling through bureaucracy and showed little interest in political reforms or liberalism. While Alexander had taken steps to modernize the Russian state and contemplated even a representative parliament, Nicholas all but reversed these efforts. He centralized power by making government ministers solely accountable to him and subject to his micromanagement. His insecurity began almost immediately when a faction within the Russian military, known as the Decembrists, orchestrated an uprising against the newly crowned Tsar. The rebellion was swiftly put down, but after this rude awakening into rulership, Nicholas used state censorship and police scrutiny to stifle any dissenting voices. Meanwhile, a rising middle class was being influenced by European culture and ideas. Philosophical arguments and literary criticism provided a subtle outlet for opposing ideas. One such group was the Petrashevsky Circle, which was given its name by its leader. Mikhail Petrashev's dedication to the ideas of socialist utopia led him to amass a substantial collection of forbidden books that he allowed friends and colleagues to explore. He advocated for democracy and the emancipation of serfdom, stressing the importance of extensive groundwork among the masses to prepare for revolutionary action. Similar to many members of the Russian intelligentsia, their commitment to the people was more abstract than actual. In their ivory towers, they were far removed from the lowly serfs they claimed to love. Petrashev's residence served as a weekly gathering place for intellectuals to discuss partisan ideas. Members could read books on materialist philosophy, utopian socialism, and the history of revolutionary movements from his personal library. Among these people was Fyodor Dostoevsky. By 1845, the circle around Petrashev had greatly expanded, and he had become a prominent figure in the social and intellectual life of St. Petersburg. Dostoevsky initially perceived these weekly discussions as regular social gatherings without any overt conspiratorial undertones, but in 1848 all this changed. As revolutions swept across Europe, the circle's membership grew even more, and their discussions evolved into more serious, formal, and clandestine meetings. As the Tsar and the Russian nobility were taking note of the changing political landscape across Europe, members of the Petrashevsky Circle were transitioning from intellectuals into revolutionaries. The revolutions of 1848 spontaneously erupted across numerous European states, nations, empires, without any international coordination. Although many of the achievements were short-lived, their impact would be felt for decades after. There isn't a single theory or catalyst to explain why everything seemed to happen at once, and this wave of revolutions is still the most extensive and widespread across Europe that has ever happened. It affected over 50 countries without any centralized coordination, and given the many locations and nations involved, it's difficult to attribute a single cause. There were harvest failures in 1839 and the subsequent years that resulted in mass starvation, migration, and civil unrest, mostly affecting peasants and the growing urban working classes. Industrialization led to a decline in agricultural investment, as states sought funds for railways and industrialization. This triggered financial crises in various countries. Social changes led to urban population growth, with laborers enduring long hours and struggling to afford food and housing. The rise of liberalism, socialism, and nationalism, along with discontent with political leadership, led to demands for republicanism, constitutional governments, and universal suffrage. Some historians point to these economic and political crises as key factors, while others emphasize the importance of social and ideological turmoil. Yet another component was a deep currency of nationalism beneath the surface, which moved many to violence. As ideas became dangerous, ruling elites quickly sought to stamp them out and controlled the flow of information. Most of the major uprisings were suppressed the following year, yet even then, much had changed. In Germany, peasants were granted new land rights. Democracy persisted in France. Prussia established a parliament based on limited suffrage, and the Habsburg monarchy implemented a more centralized, bureaucratic structure to replace localized land rule. Meanwhile, Russia's citizens and intellectuals felt that they were being left behind and still frozen in the past. In 1849, desperate to maintain control, Nicholas I became fixated on the potential revolution in his own backyard. Petrashev's history of openly challenging conventional beliefs had long been of interest to the secret police in Russia. After the revolutions of 1848, the Russian government intensified their surveillance by deploying an agent named Antonelli to infiltrate the group. Antonelli began attending meetings and would report back his findings to his superiors. From his report, the Russian government made note of the group's critical ideas of the church and state and began arresting members. In response to charges of treason, Dostoevsky claimed he was a member purely out of intellectual interest rather than any revolutionary aims. Nevertheless, he and his fellows were arrested in April 1849. The detainees were held in the heavily fortified Peter and Paul fortress, housing the most dangerous inmates. Here, Dostoevsky's idealism turned into cruel reality. His case underwent a 4-month review until he was eventually sentenced to death by firing squad. On a cold December morning, he was transported to St. Petersburg and divided among his peers into 3-man groups. Dostoevsky, terrified for his life, now faced the real possibility of death for his ideas. Facing the firing squad, tremulous and prepared for the worst, the execution was suddenly halted as a cart rolled into the square. Right up until then, Dostoevsky believed this to be the last moment of his life, and later contemplated the philosophical and spiritual implications of this moment in his later work. It would turn out that the cart had a message from the Tsar, one that was arguably merciful or more cruel depending on how you looked at it. Instead of death, he was set to face 8 years in a labor camp in western Siberia, one of the coldest and harshest environments on Earth. With his fellow prisoners, Dostoevsky embarked on a 14-day sleigh journey from St. Petersburg, eventually reaching a small town called Tobolsk. Despite the dire circumstances, Dostoevsky provided solace to his fellow inmates, even persuading one not to take his own life. In Tobolsk, the prisoners received food and clothing from Decembrist women, along with copies of the New Testament that each contained a 10-ruble banknote. 11 days later, Dostoevsky arrived in Omsk, accompanied by just one other member of the Petrashevsky Circle. When they reached the labor camp, the conditions were dismal. The barracks where they slept was marked by unbearable heat in the summer and severe cold in the winter. The floors were deteriorating, and filth accumulated everywhere, making it treacherous to move about. The overcrowded rooms offered no space to maneuver, leading to deplorable living conditions. The entire building was tainted by the odor from the privy, and a small bathroom had to accommodate over 200 individuals. In addition, the pervasive presence of fleas, lice, and black beetles added to the misery. Classified as one of the most dangerous convicts, Dostoevsky had his hands and feet shackled at all times. His reading material was restricted to the New Testament Bible. Alongside his frequent seizures, he suffered from hemorrhoids, weight loss, and endured bouts of fever from the extreme heat and cold at night. Periodically, Dostoevsky was sent to the military hospital, where he had access to newspaper and novels by Dickens. While he garnered respect from his fellow prisoners, Some Polish political inmates held a strong disdain for him due to his Russian nationalism and anti-Polish sentiments. For the next 4 years, he would spend the days in grueling labor and the nights in insufferable torment. The predominant occupation in the gulags or Katorga camps revolved around mining and timber-related work. The prisoners would be organized early in the morning and sent out to work until nightfall, often with little rest and under the constant harassment and belittlement of the guards, who perceived them as less than human. Through the entire ordeal, the only thing that kept Dostoevsky going was his affirmation of the human spirit and his belief in God. He would transform himself from these experiences and begin his first steps towards the greater works of his career. This transformation is chronicled in The House of the Dead, Dostoevsky's fictional memoir, which details his shift from airy intellectualism to the hardened realities of life and the enduring strength of the human spirit. House of the Dead follows a Russian gentleman sentenced to 10 years of hard labor in Siberia for murdering his wife. Initially repulsed by his surroundings and fellow prisoners, the main character undergoes a profound spiritual transformation during his incarceration. Dostoevsky portrays the inmates with empathy, recognizing their courage, resourcefulness, and talent, despite the prison's brutal practices. The book centers on the narrator's evolving understanding of the prison and its inhabitants. The novel reflects Dostoevsky's own transformation, where he learned to see the humanity and moral qualities of those around him in living color, and in a much more focused way than the hazy socialistic philosophies he used to subscribe to. Dostoevsky's later novels would go on to vividly illustrate the real-life consequences of imposing utopian ideals and what transpires when the ethical takes a backseat to the political. His time in the Gulag reasserted the importance of morality and underscored the author's experiences as repercussions for being overly radical and not grounded to the common struggle of the layperson. While there might be debate as to who is to blame, whether it be the Russian Tsar, the nobility, the disorganized and oppressed peasants themselves, or the optimistic intellectuals of the time, Dostoevsky would argue that deciding who to blame is completely missing the point. Dostoevsky started off his career believing in the compatibility of socialism and Christianity, and later rejected this notion. His earlier stance indicated a form of Christian socialism, but he emphasized that socialism couldn't function solely on principles of individual rights or general utility. It required solidarity, grace, brotherly love, and freedom. A key lesson from Dostoevsky is the need to move beyond a granular conception of justice and embrace a more inclusive view of the world. It's less about the political or economic systems and more about the bonds among citizens and societal groups. This is not to say that serfdom was ever a good idea or even sustainable, but rather correcting it or any other unjust system could be just as bad or worse if it's not done in an ethical way. Dostoevsky saw a vision of the ideal political state as being born out of the excellence of collective life building, rather than war with an enemy. True excellence, in Dostoevsky's view, lay in fostering a political community of individuals striving for the best collective life. His hope was that a future could be achieved where life on earth would be free from war and political division, and to do that, it required people to look inward rather than outward. After 4 years in the Gulag, these fraternal concepts of brotherly love and Christian values ultimately served a larger purpose and transformed the once naive radical into a more tempered intellectual, one who had experienced the first-hand consequences of trying to change too much too quickly, and one who saw the intellectuals that claimed to love their fellow man trample over those fraternal bonds to achieve their own aims at all costs.